Director Iyer, please take it away. We have a 1 hour segment for this, I believe. Let me just double check on that. Yeah, we have a 1 hour segment for this. So if you could keep your presentation to about 30 minutes or less, that would be ideal.
Great, thank you.
Can't hear you. Nope, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have Stephanie Smith, Assistant Director, with me, and Sarah Parnillum, who's head of our Data and Policy Analysis Division, also in the meeting. Purpose of today's presentation is to provide an overview of the city's capital budget, which is done annually by the Department of Planning. Sarah, could I have the first slide, please? Sarah?
Yeah, give me a moment.
This first slide shows the relationship of the Planning Department to the Department of Finance and the capital budget to the operating budget. So essentially, the Department of Finance provides the overall budget structure of the city, the big picture financial planning, as well as manages the operating budget, then delegates to the Department of Planning the preparation of the capital budget. And if we could get the next slide, Sarah. The Planning Department prepares this budget on an annual cycle. I'm going to walk you through it real briefly. A lot of people don't know it. In September and October, with the Department of Finance, we determine the target of the capital budget. That is the general parameters of how much money we will have to spend in the upcoming fiscal year for the capital budget. That target then is broken up among the 8 agencies that participate in the capital budget, and it goes out to them in September. They are provided with a range within which they have to work, within which they have to develop their capital budget. They have the fall, they have 3 months to figure that out and submit in December. They submit back to the Planning Department their proposed capital budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And then between December and February, the planning staff meets with the agencies, tries to work it towards an affordable solution. Then also in January begins the public process. We have a multi-step public process, and each agency presents to the Planning Commission, which has a charter function to oversee the capital budget, both an overview of their needs and a list of their priorities for the budget year, as well as the 5 years past the budget year. After all the agencies have presented to the Planning Commission, our staff formulates a recommendation. It's essentially juggling the amounts between the agencies to make sure that all the essential priorities of the city capital needs are funded. Then in March, it goes back to the Planning Commission for a final vote. It then goes through a 4-step process with the Board of Finance, the Board of Estimates, and then the City Council for adoption on July 1st of the budget year. So that's essentially the cycle. I want to point out that the Planning Department almost never initiates a capital request. The agencies that administer the spending of the budget administer the capital request, not rarely the Planning Department. Let's go to the next slide. I think we can skip through this pretty quickly. It is a charter function of the Planning Commission, which oversees the physical development of the city. The capital budget is a tool for overseeing the physical development, just like the zoning ordinances. The budget year of the CIP is enacted in ordinance. the 5 outer years of the capital budget, while are provided for planning purposes, but they are not adopted into the budget. Next slide, please. The general policies emanating from the Board of Estimates for a capital improvement is a physical betterment. It's a tangible item. It is over $50,000. It does not include vehicles. It does not include repairs or maintenance costs of an emergency nature or maintenance less than 100,000, and it doesn't include any salaries which are in the operating budget except those that are capitalized as part of the project. So unless they're directly working on the capital project, it does not include any salaries. Next slide. Now, this is important. This is really important. This is 5 of the 8 agencies that participate in the capital budget. And it tries to get at the relationship between the need and the supply of capital available to the city of Baltimore. So these agencies here are essentially the infrastructure agencies of the city. It does not include HCD or BDC, the redevelopment agencies of the city. It does not include affordable housing, and it does not include the schools. The schools, for example, to stand up the $1 billion 21st century model requires the city to set aside $19 million a year, 1/5 of its capital budget, to commit to that fund, and it does so. This list right here shows a $2 billion backlog in deferred capital needs for the city. Now, if we very roughly spend $100 million a year, which is roughly our budget for the capital budget, that's roughly 20% or a little less than 20% of our capital needs. And if you think about the city needing to renew itself every 20 years, that seems to be on target. But again, it does not include housing community development. It does not include the Baltimore Development Corporation. It does not include affordable housing, and it does not include the schools. So you can get a sense of the mismatch between the capital needs of the city and the capital supply of the city. Now, what are we doing about that? Let's go to the next slide. This is an example. The Department of General Services manages the city's real estate portfolio. Not all of it, but a big portion of it. And that real estate is the Department of General Services really on top of the condition of our real estate. They have really good data on that. And they can show you when the building is the condition of the building has deteriorated to the point where it's cheaper to build a new building than to repair an old building. And that's what this, in fact, shows you, that where the condition index of the city's building stock deteriorates to a certain point, then it's cheaper for the city to replace the building. And we're rapidly approaching that. So what do we do about this? As I showed you in the previous slide, we don't have enough money to maintain our building stock. So we have embarked on a proposal with the Planning Commission and the Department of General Services to look at ways to reduce the amount of real estate that the city manages and owns. And I think hopefully next year we'll be coming back with some really good examples that we're trying to work through now to reduce, consolidate our real estate portfolio to create a more manageable portfolio that we can afford to maintain. So let's go back to the next slide, please. This gives you a sense of the ups and downs of the capital budget over the years. Could we go to the next slide, please, Sarah? One thing I want to point out that's very important: the capital budget looks bigger in many ways than it really is. So in this pie chart, the two largest categories, county grants and revenue loans, are both enterprise funds. In other words, they are dedicated funds that are targeted towards our utilities, our water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. They cannot be used to repair our real estate portfolio. They cannot be used to invest in neighborhoods. They cannot be used for the wide variety of things that our general funds, our bond funds, can be used for. So while the overall capital budget may be $400 million, for example, this year, the actual amount available to target towards some of the needs and opportunities of the city is much smaller than that. Next slide, please. This shows more the reality of what we as a Department of Planning work with to budget for the capital needs. This is the capital budget without the enterprise fund. So you can see how it goes up and down over the years. Essentially, it is four components. The largest component is what the voters vote on every 2 years. They vote on four general categories of expenditures that the city takes to the ballot box. These are the city bond funds that the full faith of the city of Baltimore is behind these bond funds. They offer the most flexible debt source that the city has. Then the Bureau of Finance also determines how much city general funds, we call this PAYGO, these are funds from the annual operating budget. It is considered to be good management to dedicate some of your operating budget towards your capital needs, to not incur debt for all of your capital needs. That's the blue line in this one. And that varies from year to year depending on the sources and uses of the city's operating budget. Then there's also a category of highway user general funds and transportation revenue bonds. I'm going to come back to these in the sense we are now borrowing as much in transportation um, funding as we are receiving. So this is essentially becoming a wash for the city. Could I go to the next one, Sarah? I mentioned the general bonds are broken into four categories, and these are the full categories. The community economic development loan that funds HCD, BDC, the redevelopment activity of the city, and Park Heights and Chum and Broadway East and Uplands all over the city. The affordable housing loan, which is a relatively new pot of money, about 3 years old. Um, the recreation and parks and public facilities, that's all the all the infrastructure needs of the city, the Department of General Services, Department of Recreation and Parks, all those kinds of things. And then, as I said earlier, we dedicate $19 million a year to support the 21st Century Initiative jointly with the state of Maryland and the Baltimore City Public School System. Next slide, please. This is the planning department's recommendations by agency for fiscal year 22. So it's broken up um, by agency, and within each agency there are a wide variety of projects. They are primarily prioritized by the agency. So for example, I'm going to pick on general services because we know that a lot. A lot of their priorities have to do with health and safety issues. For example, the building envelope is almost always, if not always, the number one priority. That be the roof and the skin of the building protects it from future damage. So if we don't pay attention to that, next year's capital budget will be that much worse, that much more difficult. City of Baltimore suffered from a ransomware attack, and the BCIT, the Baltimore City Information Technology, which administers our technology needs for the city, is part of the capital budget. Now, because of that, um, Department of Public Works, I mentioned the enterprise funds, water, wastewater, and stormwater, but there's also a Bureau of Public Works that is not an enterprise fund, and that is the Bureau of Solid Waste. And this is an agency that has a timeline connected with the incinerator, has a timeline connected with the landfill, all of which need to be rethought and replanned and restructured in the next 5 to 10 years to resolve our solid waste issues. I'll keep going. Next slide, please. Oh, we're already on everybody else. Stephanie, would you? I'll introduce Stephanie Smith, our assistant director, in a second. But planning department um, has been interested in the equity issue for over 5 years now. We initially started in 2015 with the Equity and Planning Committee. For the last 3 cycles of the capital budget, we have focused an increasingly sharpened equity lens on the capital budget. This year, I'm gonna, yeah, this year we increased the this year, we required each agency to submit a physical location for each capital budget request. That had never been done before. Many agencies operate with large topical sort of bulk accounts. This year, we initiated this to improve our accuracy and our ability to project our equity lens on the capital budget. So this is a major um, step forward. We also formed a committee of the 8 agencies with the Office of Equity and Civil Rights to coordinate the capital budget internally before it went to the Planning Commission. It also had the benefit of coordinating the interagency projects better. Um, Stephanie may want to talk a little bit about our urban sustainability director's lens. If we have time for that, Mr. Chair, I think it would be helpful for the public to understand our lens.
Absolutely. Assistant Director.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to elaborate on the fact that because we have an Office of Sustainability that's housed within the Department of Planning, we as a city are a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And as such, USDN has created its own equity lens that they've been deploying and helping to implement across their membership. And it's a pretty, I think, useful 4-part lens because it strikes to the heart of several questions we need to ask as not only an agency, but across city government. As we are embarking on implementing programs and policies, we must ask questions related to the structural inequities that have been baked in. Which groups, which entities, which populations have routinely had more access to having influence over this system, program, or a particular set of outcomes. The second piece of the lens is procedural. And I think that's where, in many ways, the heart of equity work is housed, because oftentimes we're doing things not because laws or ordinances require us to do them in a certain way. It's out of custom, out of habit. So a lot of what we've been mentioning to you is that different agencies, for example, for the purposes of the capital budget, they've been devising their own recommendations that we in turn evaluate. But a lot of that is siloed considerations. So that's why we piloted across interagency opportunity for people to evaluate the portfolio as a whole versus only the the usual, which is only the projects that they've been submitting. So that's an example of kind of tweaking procedure to see if we can get outcomes that are more equitable. But that's just one example. Distributional is about how access to power and resources are distributed either through a population or through geography. And because we know Baltimore City is a city that is, steeped in residential segregation, in many ways, the distribution of power and resources within geography can serve as a proxy for distribution of power and resources across populations. And then the last part of that lens, and I think it's the part that we all struggle with, not only within government, but also external to government, be it anchor institutions or community groups, and that's transgenerational equity. How are we including people under 50, under 30 in our decision making, and how are we considering the undue burdens we could be placing on them as future taxpayers of this city? So I wanted to just kind of give you that quick summary of our four-part equity lens that we've been utilizing as we continue to endeavor to have much more equitable outcomes for our capital budget moving forward. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Sarah, could I have the next slide, please?
I lost my ability to share. Oh, it's back. Welcome 1 second.
There we go. Thank you. The next slide, I'm trying to demonstrate our analysis this year with our geocoding. It's still a work in progress. These two maps break down the CIP by geographic area. The one on the left does not include Department of Public Works, and the one on the right does. As you know, the Department of Public Works is a huge part of the city's capital budget. So it as you can see from these maps, it skews the map considerably. So for many purposes, people want to know what the general capital budget is funding rather than the utilities. And that, in that case, I would refer you to the map on the left. The darker the color, the higher per capital per capita capital expenditure, and the lighter, the lower the per capita capital expenditure. On the right, as you can probably guess, some things are thrown off by large water, wastewater, and stormwater facilities, and that's reflected in the map on the right. We get the next slide, please, Sarah. These bar charts may be hard to read, but they break it down, the ratio per capita action by percent of residents that are Black, and median household income. So I think it shows a relatively progressive reflection on the capital budget. I would note that we have, as of this fiscal year 22, we have approximately 65% of the capital budget geocoded. So that still leaves a long way to go where we need to improve our accuracy. Next slide, please. Then I'll try to summarize some of the projects. I'll read them very quickly. 7 million for IT. Again, we had a ransomware attack 2 years ago. We need to up our game in our IT. But this particular year, we earmarked $1 million for broadband specifically for public housing sites. So that we hope to match that with federal money and or state money to provide access in our public housing sites, broadband access. 6 million for mayoralty and planning. These are primarily cultural institutions, as well as 4 million for the Penn Station redevelopment project. 11.6 million for city buildings. So we mentioned the problems and challenges we have with real estate, but we're still spending $11.6 million on city buildings. Wish we were spending 20, but it includes the Southeast Community Action Center, fire department facilities, police department facilities, library facilities, you name it. The $19 million for schools I've mentioned before, 32 million for recreation and parks, including the next to last payment, I believe, for the Chickweb Recreation Center and the Perkins Somerset Old Town project, 5 million for Reedburg Park improvements, South Baltimore, 4.5 million for various pool improvements, and 2.2 million for the Quinns Falls Athletic Fields. 75 million for the transportation infrastructure, and I want to come talk about this a little bit. 10 years ago, the budget for the Baltimore Department of Transportation was, roughly speaking, $250 million a year. It is now $150 million a year and has been since the Great Recession of 2009. So the Department of Transportation has lost over $1 billion in the last 10 years in revenue to support the horizontal infrastructure, is what we call it in the city, and it shows. This budget includes 15 million for bridges, which is required commitment. It's a 20% match to the 80% federal money we get for bridges. 13.8 for major road construction, 18.6 for pedestrian and bike and transit and safety improvements, and 5 million, which is earmarked for improvements to the conduit system. Next slide, Sarah. I mentioned challenge in the Bureau of Solid Waste. Despite the challenges, we've carved out almost $5 million for solid waste. 3 of that is a committed, dedicated fund. We're saving up money to redo the landfill, to expand the capacity of the landfill, which I believe begins to run out of capacity around 2027. We also have OSHA violations in some of the facilities, and we are earmarking, setting aside money for future transfer facilities. $45 million for Department of Housing Community Development. This includes matching money. We match with the state of Maryland Department of Housing Community Development for demolition and stabilization of vacant and abandoned buildings. This funds all our home ownership programs and home repair programs for legacy residents, as well as the major redevelopment projects, of which we have a number of in the city, throughout the city, as well as $10 million for Baltimore Development Corporation, including 3.5 is the last payment on the new animal care facility, 3.6 for the Warner Street Entertainment Corridor, and 900,000 to finish funding the Lexington Market reconstruction project. 172 million for water related projects, 6.5 for stormwater related, 96 million for wastewater. And that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation on the fiscal year 22 capital budget.
Thank you, Director Ryer. I'm going to turn it over to Council Vice President Middleton. Council Vice President, if you could chair for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, I see one hand raised, and that's Councilwoman Ramos. You have questions for Director Ryder?
Yes, thank you, Madam Vice President, Director Ryer, and colleagues. I guess this would be another request. I have the capital budget in front of me, and there are several places where we see sort of, citywide facade improvements and, affordable housing line item, and a couple of others. I wonder if we could, and I'm happy to outline this for you in a spreadsheet. I wonder if we can get the list of where all of this money is going in particular, because some of these are consolidated. So would that be all right, Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead. Director Ryder?
Certainly. So if you could send the specific line items that you're referring to, we probably, in the case of facade grants, for example, we would go back to the Baltimore Development Corporation, which administers those. If they're for commercial properties, that's administered by the Alderman Development Corporation, and they could identify which specific commercial areas they were working with on facade improvements.
Okay, and then another example would be like demolition of blighted vacant structures. That could be ongoing. And maybe some of this has to go directly to some of the agencies. But I'll send you a spreadsheet and we can go from there. And then my second question.
And before you ask your question, so Director Ryder, make sure you get those to Nina, and then Nina can give those to us.
Is that request
Right.
8, I guess, or 9?
Yes. Go ahead. What's
Okay.
your second? Mhm.
And then Director Ryer, I don't know if this is a question for you or if I should have asked it under finance, but the borrowing capacity for the city.
Yes.
So there's sort of there's a couple of, putting aside the enterprise funds for a second. So there's the 80 million that we vote on each year. And then there's another pot that comes either from the general fund or we borrow some more. Do you know if there's possibility of increasing that amount at any time? Because it seems to me like, and I realize it's based on debt service too, because we got to pay it back.
Correct.
But it seems like there's such a huge need, and you pointed that out. It's like a over $2 billion need. And it seems like we need to be able to borrow a little bit more to be able to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish. Again, I apologize. I don't know that you can answer that, but maybe it's a finance question, but is it possible that we should and can borrow more?
Chris,
Yes,
I'm on here.
Oh,
Chris,
okay.
I'm on here. I can take that one.
Finance question.
So I guess first things first, we have increased the limit over time. So only a decade ago, we were borrowing $50 million a year. It was bumped up to 65, and then it was bumped up to 80. So we do look at that and make adjustments if we think we can afford more. The city does a formal debt policy, has a consultant come in and look at our capacity. And, one of the things they look at is what are our debt ratios as compared to overall, operating expenditures versus the tax base, to give us a sense of if we're within those ranges. And we always come out that we're in a healthy range. But I mean, I think you said it yourself, is that you have to pay the debt service back. And, I need to remind folks over and over again, our next decade does not look great financially because of the Kerwin commitment that the city's going to have to pay. So borrowing now and kicking that down the road, I don't think is a good idea. We were, in our last debt capacity study, it was a real stretch even to get to that 80. And we also used, I would remind folks too, that we also used the state's borrowing authority to do $15 million of county transportation bonds, which also falls back to the city as debt service. So we've always felt like, we're really at this point stretched to the max on what we can do capital wise. I think I'd also say that, from what I've seen historically, it's easy to just raise the debt limit. But if we were to say, let's borrow $15 million more per year, we should be looking to do that in PAYGO capital, not in borrowing authority. Let's force ourselves to make the hard choice and say, is there things on the operating side that we could do without in order to fund more capital, which I agree. I mean, if I had a choice between 20 million more of capital or operating, I would take capital in a heartbeat. But bumping up the debt authority, I think sometimes just ends up being just kind of like an easy solution, and then it comes back to bite us later when we have those debt service costs. So sorry if that was a kind of a long answer to that question, but that's kind of the current status as I see it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I guess we could debate this a little bit another day, but it seems like the more we invest, the more return we're going to get eventually. We'll have more people moving in. We'll have higher tax, revenue as we do renovations. I mean, it seems like making an investment now is actually going to pay off later. And we have all this deferred maintenance. So that's just a statement that, I mean, maybe we can talk offline, but I think we need to think about this a little bit more as we think about the capital budget moving forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Chair, you're back. It's all yours.
Thank you, Madam VP. We have Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Director Ryer, for the walkthrough. I'm really interested in learning more about the process. Specifically, I know that capitals, you defined it a little bit in your presentation. It's 50 items more than $50,000, not of an emergency nature, so on and so forth. But I know that sometimes we do fund programs through the capital improvement budget. I'm really curious how we think about that, and to give you an example of some of these programs that we'll fund through the capital improvement plan, facade improvement. I think that's a really good example. We've seen some of those dollars come through. We've also done it for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and funding some of the service fees and otherwise. Can you give a little bit of insight on how we make those decisions and when we include some degree of programmatic funding or grant funding of that sort through the capital improvement plan?
Sure. Yeah. So I think what you're referring to, we, of course, as Mr. Senemy mentioned, the operating budget is stressed also. So some programs that have a long-term benefit, for example, a facade improvement or an improvement to a home, such as a new roof on a home of a low-income senior, those are capital projects in the sense the very nature of the project is a capital project. A mortgage is a long-term investment by the city. So similar to, as Councilwoman Ramos mentioned earlier, these are investments in the city of the future. And that's how we justify them. They are long-term investments in the city. They could be paid out of an operating budget also, but because that budget is stretched thin, we choose to use our capital to do so.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, and I didn't bring that up to sort of question it. I think it's a useful ability. So I think that the real question there is trying to get some transparency into how those decisions are made and where those decisions are made. I guess maybe exactly piggybacking off of Councilwoman Ramos's point to ask about that.
Director Ryan, you mind if I jump in real quick?
Sure.
One thing to add is that so from a financial perspective, moving it to one bucket or the other, like Director Ryer said, it's a cost either way. We do have administratively, it's much easier for the city as a whole if something either all falls in the capital budget or all falls in the operating budget, just for ease of coordination between our agencies. There are a handful of things that we do have to have an operating and a capital component. But I'd also mention that part of our funding is PAYGO dollars from the general fund. So if we're borrowing money in its GO bond, we have to be pretty sure that those benefits are going to be stretched out over a longer term period, just from a good kind of accounting perspective. But if we fund things with PAYGO capital that comes from just general recurring revenue sources, just from a pure reporting and accounting standpoint, it doesn't matter as much because that's the more conservative treatment. It's recurring dollars, it's current dollars, you're spending it on a project, and it's not capitalized over a long period of time. So we have, our office in planning has worked together over years to try to identify what are those more gray area type things that either have an operating component or that could fall in either bucket. And usually we try to fund those with PAYGO capital rather than GO bond dollars.
And Councilman, just to add on to that, we do in certain instances look to see if the project is actually going to be appreciating over the full 20 years. So not in this budget, but in prior years' budgets, we've done short-term financing for certain IT projects where we know the replacement cycle is every 5 years as opposed to every 20. So we do try to be creative to kind of squeeze out more of those GO bonds for the bigger infrastructure and truer capital projects. But as Director Wire and Director Senemy have said, we are just real short on both sides of the house.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. The other thing I'm really interested in, I don't know if conversations are being had, but in understanding and maybe reevaluating the rubric for the capital improvement plan. I know we talked a little bit about equity and how those dollars have been spent throughout the city. And it looks like we've had some improvement, but you know, I know specifically I can think about instances in my district where because certain low-income neighborhoods are next to certain upper-income neighborhoods, and they're captured in the same sort of um, um, zip code, maybe, or technical neighborhood breakdown by however we measure it. Sometimes those communities aren't considered. So really curious about any efforts to be more thoughtful about that rubric. Are we looking at that? Is that something we're thinking about?
Yeah. I think Stephanie Smith will try to answer that.
I'm just waiting to be recognized. Okay, didn't want to jump in. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilman, for that question. It's a really important one because, as you noted, depending at the scale of geography you're using, it can really obscure some other more granular challenges. So we do use neighborhood statistical areas as well as community statistical areas for our analysis. As you probably note, the neighborhood statistical areas are smaller, so you get a little more true, picture of a community. There are a couple of things I want to bring to your attention that preceded your arrival and things that we're trying to strengthen based on those efforts. As we noted, traditionally agencies would devise their recommendations or requests based on either internal master planning processes that they've undergone over a period of years, or their own kind of agency-driven focus groups or public comment circumstances. So what we're trying to do is just figure out how we can bring more community access, because it's a pretty opaque process, right? If you're just a standard community member. So we did a series of capital budget specific pop-ups across the city that brought the capital budget staff from all the various agencies that participate in the capital budget and just kind of broke down that wall so that community members would have direct contacts at DOT, at the various agencies, because oftentimes people didn't always know how to elevate a community capital need, within the existing framework. So that is still not as a direct pipeline as I think we would like. We would like something a little more systematic, but we knew that at the beginning, people didn't even know who to talk to, and we wanted to kind of break down that wall. So as you can imagine, we had a virtual version of that with our planning commission, I believe in August of last year, but the pandemic kind of stymied those pop-ups that we had been doing up until that point. But I think now that we're turning the corner, we want to not only revisit those pop-ups, but also figure out how we can more systematically kind of connect community voice to the agency recommendations. One of the things with the pilot interagency review effort that we started for this fiscal year, one of the things that we had wanted to think about was how we could actually have some level of community oversight and input to that review process too. As you know, we're in a new administration, so we felt like we were kind of in between, decision makers. So we're hoping to revisit that as well, because we think the combination of breaking down that wall, but also getting some more community input in a more robust and systematic way will get to some of those outcomes that you've lifted up that are incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's all my questions. And just to sort of hammer home the point, I think for communities, understanding how these things are evaluated certainly helps. I think we're already beginning to get a little more granular in a way to capture some of the equity issues, but also, Stephanie, you hit the nail on the head. Sometimes folks don't even understand the process, and so to get the applications in and know what you guys are looking for to make a competitive ask, I think, is sometimes the difficulty as well.
Thank you, colleagues. VP Middleton, Schleifer, Mr. President, Councilman Stokes. Councilman Stokes, floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you. This question is actually filing for Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Chris, and Deputy Director and Delegate Stephanie Smith. That's a whole lot to swallow. This is probably for the delegate. How many staff members are focused on ensuring all projects reviewed using an equity lens? That's my first question. And the second question, can you speak about an ongoing employee training that focuses on racial and cultural sensitivity?
Thank you, Councilman, for that question. So your first question, I just want to make sure I was clear. You wanted to know about the review of capital budgets within the context of this hearing, right? How many staff are designated to? I just want to make sure I was following.
Yes.
Okay, so for the purpose of that, it's actually a small team. There's actually 2 primary staffers that work on the capital budget. It was brought to my awareness that probably easily 10 to 15 years ago, that it used to be an actual division of the agency. It actually used to be a division. So there's definitely been a curtailing in the staff capacity. And the reason why I wanted to just lift that up is that many of the very thoughtful and important questions that your colleagues have lifted up, particularly around some of the funds that are given out for facade improvements and other improvements of homes for seniors that need roofs and stuff like that. Of course, you don't know the addresses, the locations of those things up front, right? Because you have to go through the process to give them. But if you have more staff, you can do more aggressive look backs. So right now we really depend on the agencies to provide us the data around the look backs of where certain dollars go, because we don't have staff capacity to kind of do anything more than prepare the budget. So there's 2 primary professionals that do that. I'm sorry, you're on mute, dear Mr. Councilman.
So y'all actually have a waiting list on that particular, because that's been an issue. I've been talking about our seniors and getting new roofs put on their house. So there is a waiting list. And my question would be, well, I'll come back to that. My second question, can you speak about an ongoing employee training that focus on racial and cultural sensitivity?
Yes, so as you probably know, we were, I don't know if we were the first, but I definitely think we were one of the first agencies to embark on our own internal equity committee that was staff driven. It did not come from any mandate from leadership, be it in City Hall or at the director level of our agency. So we have a standing committee of staff that also have subcommittees, and they're focused on implementing our staff's equity action plan. So there are trainings that are embedded in that are often facilitated by staff themselves, or we work with outside parties, because as you can imagine, we do not have really a budget, to hire a lot of outside people. And we also avail ourselves of the training resources provided at the Department of Human Resources here in the city of Baltimore. So I would say that much of the work of our agency is around operationalizing the action plan with fidelity to some core issues. One is pipeline. We want to ensure that we have a hiring and internship pipeline that is racially diverse and reflective of the demographics of our city. So we actually have a subcommittee that was focused exclusively on that, figuring out how we can, tighten up our own procedures or expand the ways that we advertise, promote, and make people aware of opportunities, but also figuring out how we can work with our colleague agencies like DHR to figure out what are some of the technical impediments to people even being captured in our applicant pool. So we had a really, I think, productive open house for some vacant positions we have now with Morgan State, for example, which obviously has a School of Architecture and Planning. And we realized these are the types of things we need to be instituting all the time, not just because we have a pandemic, but these are things that are also replicable across city government. So I would say that our equity committee drives not only training within our agency, but also drives the implementation of our equity action plan, which you can also view the status of the implementation of the action plan on a dashboard at our website, equity.baltimorecity.gov/planning.
And Mr. Chairman, I only got one request. If we can get that delegate, the list of how many people actually are on that waiting list. I know we can't have their personal information, but could I get the list, or the committee get the list to see exactly how many people are on that waiting list?
Is that a waiting list for home improvements, Councilman?
Yes, I'm sorry, yeah. The hubs, I'm sorry.
Through the Hubs program?
Yeah.
We can contact Department of Housing and Community Development for that.
Actually, Councilman, let's move that
Hold
one
on.
over to, yeah,
Okay.
for HCD. Yep.
Okay,
All right.
thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Colleagues, any other questions? Dorsey?
Yes, sir.
And I would ask, please be as brief as possible. We got lunch for 12 to 12:30.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask for the presentation. I mean, I really appreciate it. The map shows me everything that I've known about my district for years, going back to, I don't know, around the 2013 Citizens Guide to the Budget. Every single year, it shows that my district is the most underinvested capital budget in the city every single year. My district, based on a glance at that map that you produced, shows that mine, I believe, is the only district where not a single statistical area creeps out of the lowest budgeted level. So I appreciate that map telling me what I already knew. Look forward to getting that. Thank you.
So you're requesting the presentation?
That's it.
That's it. That's it. So Nina, that's not a request. Matt, you're just going to send that over to him? Matt Stegman's sending that to you right now. All right, colleagues, any other questions? Director, Assistant Director, thank you so much for being here with us. Want to thank you for all your hard work, the work around equity, and especially close collaboration with the Planning Commission. Really appreciate it. Thank you all. We're now in recess until 12:30.